Good day. A couple of hours ago in a previous video, I said that the indications seemed to me to point to a major Russian offensive being prepared in eastern Ukraine, probably as a knockout blow, an offensive that would, in effect, take a major step towards ending the war. Well, the last couple of hours have seen what may be the first steps towards such an offensive, with a major intensification of Russian attacks, and they've come at an unexpected place. They've come in the fortified zone, the Ukrainian fortified zone, opposite Donetsk city. That there's been reports of a Russian breakthrough, that the Russians have punched a hole through this fortified line, and apparently the shelling has been of a level of intensity that has not been seen before in this conflict. All of this, by the way, is taking place at the same time as the Russians, a little further north in Donetsk region, continue to advance from the Uglegorsk thermal power station, this fortified place that the Ukrainians had turned into one of the major points of their defense system. And there's been some reports that the Ukrainians have now once again started to try to pull back from some of the places on the Siversk, Solidar, Bakhmut defense line, and that this defense line is now definitely cracking. Well, we shall see. Well, that's actual news from the battlefield. I've seen now multiple reports about this. I've seen it from many sources. There's no doubt at all that there is fighting of a very intense level going on in Donetsk region, that the Russians are dealing out a major hammer blow in Donetsk region. And I have to say that I sense that indeed the Russians are now moving to clear Donetsk region, and that this will undoubtedly be done. Well, I expect it to be done, as I said previously, over the course of August. However, it's worth saying that at the same time as all this has been happening in Donetsk, the Western media has been reporting something entirely different. They have been overwhelmingly focused on events further west in Kherson region, specifically on the missile attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge, which is supposed to be the major supply route to the Russian forces west of the Dnieper River. There's been some rather excited commentary, especially in the British media, that the Russian forces west of the Dnieper River, said to number 15 to 20,000, have now been cut off from resupply. And there's also been some excited talk about the Ukrainians achieving a breakthrough, in other words, that they've established a crossing, a beachhead across the Ingulets River. Now, I talked about the Ukrainian advance to the Ingulets River and the fact that they'd established 3 pontoon bridges across the Ingulets River some days ago. But interestingly enough, it's only now that the British Ministry of Defence is reporting the story. And I can't help but think that the reason they've held back is because of the missile attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge, about which more in a moment. Now, I'm going to say this. Just as it was actually Russian sources which first reported that the Ukrainians had advanced to the Ingulets River and laid pontoon bridges across the Ingulets River in 3 places, so those same Russian sources over the course of yesterday were reporting that these Ukrainian forces that were attempting to cross the Ingulets River had been attacked by Russian airborne troops, paratroopers, that they'd suffered extremely heavy losses, that there'd been heavy missile and artillery attacks on these Ukrainian troops, that the pontoon bridges have all been destroyed, and that the Ukrainian troops have been hurled back and have been forced to retreat to their original positions. Now, that was said before this British Ministry of Defence briefing came out about the advance to the Ingulets River. Now note that it was the same Russian sources who reported the advance and the pontoon bridges across the Ingulets River in the first place, which is why I mentioned it in an earlier video. Well, who is telling the truth? Is it the British and the Ukrainians, specifically the British in this case, talking about this crossing of the Ingulets River, or is it the Russians? Well, I'm not there. I'm not on the ground. This time I'm going to give a pass to the story. I don't actually know. It seems more likely to me that it's the Russians. After all, they reported the advance to the Ingulets River first. So maybe they're faster and more reliable in reporting information from the ground. But I would simply say that that part of the British Ministry of Defence briefing on the fighting on the Ingulets River has already been contradicted by the Russians and may, just may, be out of date in terms of the events on the ground. Now, what's happening with the Antonovsky Bridge? Well, I said yesterday that there'd be more missile strikes on the bridge, and pictures have been appearing of more holes through the roadway. The structure of the bridge seems to be intact. I've been reading reports. All kinds of people have come forward and offered their opinions, saying that the bridge is impassable, that there's no conceivable way that it could be repaired, that the Russians would be unable to send armored vehicles across this bridge. Nobody, by the way, has ever asked whether they ever have, but that's another story. Well, and of course the attack on the bridge has now become the main story and the main reason for celebration. I don't think that's too strong a word in the Western media, and the predictions that this Russian force west of the Dnieper River has been cut off. I'm going to add a word of caution, and I really want to stress this. I'm not a military person again, but I know a certain amount about military history. I mean, like most people, I've read stories about the Second World War and about the Napoleonic Wars, and I cannot recall a single battle or a single war, in fact, that was won because somebody punched holes in a bridge. Now, of course, there's always a first time, and maybe this bridge is as important as people say, but I would have thought the railway bridge, which is apparently intact and functioning, is the more important bridge. And of course the Russians seem to be busy now trying to set up pontoon bridges across the Dnieper, though I've said previously that that might be extremely difficult to achieve given the width of this river. And of course, there's no logical reason why those bridges might not also be subject to missile strikes. So I'm going to say that I think we need to be a little cautious about some of these excited stories. I don't personally think that this bridge is quite as important as people say. I may be wrong. I think that I get the impression that the Russians are responding very calmly to this situation. There doesn't seem to be any obvious sign of panic, and the regional administrator, the Russian appointed regional administrator of Kherson region, said that food and supplies and such things for Kherson city, which did pass across the bridge, that those are secure and will be continue to be provided. Though he didn't say how, I presume, again, either across the railway bridge or by ford. And he did actually mention that, or rather Ferry, he did mention that before the construction of this bridge, there had been a ferry system to send supplies to Kherson city across the Dnieper. The Russians, of course, control the Black Sea. Their naval commander has just been making that particular point. They've had various ships. They're very accustomed to sending supplies by sea and by boat upriver. I've discussed in the past the extraordinary sophistication of the Russian transport systems using their river systems. I think people need to take a pause and slow down and think a little bit about whether, as I said, this story about the bridge is quite as exciting as some people seem to think. I would add a number of points. The first is obviously the big question is, how did these missiles reach the bridge? We heard before about the S-400 system being established in Kherson city. The Russians previously claimed that they shot down 12 missiles. Why was it that on this occasion some missiles managed to get through? Well, the short answer is that apparently this time the Ukrainians launched scores of missiles in the direction of Kherson, and this overwhelmed the defences. I've seen reports that up to 80 missiles were launched. Now, given that, as far as I understand it, no Ukrainian Soviet-era multiple rocket launch system has the range to hit Kherson city, that would presumably mean that something like 80 HIMARS missiles were launched at the bridge or at Kherson city. So one could see how the Russian air defenses were overwhelmed, but on the assumption that these were all guided missiles, one can also see how this would very rapidly deplete Ukrainian reserves if it was maintained at this kind of level. And incidentally, on the following night, there was no second missile strike against the bridge, which suggests not that the Ukrainians have shot their bolt, obviously they haven't, but that this isn't something that they can do every day. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to say. The second point I wanted to make is the rather more important one, that the media in the West is talking about an offensive, a Ukrainian offensive towards Kherson, which so far hasn't happened, and missile strikes against a bridge, which have punched holes in the bridge, but which haven't, so far as I know, actually killed anyone in Kherson city, or certainly not amongst the Russian military. Whereas they are ignoring this enormous battle that is currently taking place in Donbass, where the Russians appear to be advancing, and where all the indications are that the Ukrainians are suffering extremely heavy losses indeed. It does seem to me a little odd that one should focus on an offensive which may happen as opposed to the offensive which is happening, talk about the battle that might happen in the future as opposed to the battle which is happening now. But it is very consistent with the way in which Western media and Western governments have been covering the war in Ukraine. Way back in March, on the Duran and on this channel, I myself and my colleague Alex Christoforou were repeatedly pointing out that the focus on the events in Kiev, where very little fighting was going on, was exaggerated and was distracting attention from the far more important battle in Donbass. And it seems to me that with Kherson city and all that, we are seeing the same thing happen all over again. Now, when making this comparison, I just want to make one further observation. Kherson city is the capital of Kherson region. I don't want to in any way play down the significance if the Ukrainians were indeed to recapture it. It would be a major blow psychologically, morally, in terms of in every conceivable respect for the Russians if they either had to abandon Kherson city or if the Ukrainians were able to recapture it after a battle. But it is worth pointing out that the pre-war population of Kherson city was 290,000. The pre-war population of Mariupol, which the Russians have captured after they captured Kherson city, which is in the Donbass, was 450,000. And the population of the Severodonetsk Lysychansk conurbation, which the Russians have also recently captured, was 350,000 before the war. All of these figures, by the way, having been obtained from Wikipedia. So Kherson city is actually smaller than some of these cities in Donbass, or rather urban centers in Donbass, which the Russians have captured and which the Western media is writing so much less about. So I just want to make all of those particular points about the Kherson offensive. Now, one other very quick point before we move on to other topics, which is about the situation with respect to Western intelligence agencies. We've had now a report from CNN that the CIA, that the Western intelligence agencies have briefed Congress and have said that Russia has suffered 70,000 casualties in Ukraine. And this comes shortly after the CIA said that the Russians had had about 15,000 men killed. And the estimates of Russian losses that have been provided are enormous. And of course, British intelligence, as I said with my reference to that British military briefing, has also been talking up endlessly Ukrainian prospects throughout the war, and they're the ones who are currently talking most noisily about the Ukrainian advances in Kherson. So why is the Western media, why are the Western intelligence agencies doing this? Well, I should say first of all that the Russians have denied that these Western casualty figures, these US intelligence casualty figures, are accurate. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has just said that they're fake news. But putting all that aside, there's been an interesting article on Ron Paul's website which says that it was British and American intelligence which persuaded the Europeans to impose these across-the-board sanctions on Russia in February by essentially advising the Europeans that the Russian economy was brittle and would collapse if these sanctions, these kind of sanctions, were imposed. Something which, of course, has turned out to be untrue and which is causing the Europeans enormous, in fact, catastrophically bad economic problems. Well, that, I think, does explain a lot of the motivation of the British and American intelligence agencies if this article on Ron Paul's website is true. And I think it may be true because, of course, Ron Paul was a US congressman and his son is a senator. And though I'm not suggesting in any way that they're providing classified information to them contributors on their website, I suspect that the people who do write on their website are well informed or reasonably well informed about the generality of what is happening and about the kind of information that's coming from whom. So if that is true, then it seems to me that the British and intelligence services must be coming in for a certain amount of criticism behind the scenes from people in the various economic agencies, telling them that they got Russia and its economy entirely wrong, and that this might eventually, if this entire affair fails, lead, or possibly might lead, to consequences for the intelligence agencies themselves. Now, I don't know whether that is correct or not, but it's possible, in which case one could see why the intelligence agencies, the two intelligence agencies, or at least two intelligence communities, which predicted a swift Russian collapse in the face of sanctions, are perhaps becoming increasingly nervous and are so anxious to talk up the prospects of Ukraine in this war. They are, in effect, trying to tell people, look, we might have made a few mistakes along the way, but overall our assessment is correct. You must have confidence in it, stick by it. Soon, very soon, you see the situation reverse. You wait a little longer, you see a major Ukrainian victory in August. The Russians are at the bottom of their resources. Ukraine has only started. Russia is going to face growing economic problems at the end of this year. So just hold on, cling on a little longer, accept a little bit of rationing in Europe, accept that a few people might get a bit cold. A few factories might have to close down. But if you keep faith with us, it will all turn right in the end. And that's a very, very human motivation. It's certainly the kind of motivation that agencies, bureaucracies, and intelligence communities ultimately are bureaucracies, are vulnerable to, especially of course, as they must be worried about potential effects on funding. And of course, if questions start mounting, there might of course be at some point demands for an investigation into how they got things so disastrously wrong, in which case, of course, the analysts who came up with all these wrong reports might be worried for their jobs. So that may explain a lot of this very strange reporting we're getting out of the West. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, briefly, we have to be careful when we focus so much on Ukraine, because many more things are going on in the world, and it's now becoming increasingly clear that we are drifting into a major potential crisis in the Taiwan Straits and potentially in the South China Seas. Now, the Chinese, as I reported in a video a short time ago, and in fact many people have reported, have now given extremely strong warnings to the United States, apparently the strongest warnings they've ever given, about the fact that they're prepared to take military action over Taiwan, and about their strong opposition to Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. And we've heard that people like Jake Sullivan want to call that trip off, but that people like Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, are now saying that if the trip is indeed called off, then China will have won some kind of victory. And I'm afraid the indications at the moment are that the trip is not going to be called off, and that the United States instead, or at least some people in the United States, are dangerously doubling down. And we've heard reports that a carrier task force is now steaming towards the Pacific, presumably intended to deter the Chinese. I very much fear that instead of deterring the Chinese, it is more likely to provoke them. And I think that at this moment in time, this particular moment in time, the Chinese probably have the capabilities to deal heavy blows against a task force, a carrier task force, if fighting starts in earnest. I'm not a military person, but those who have looked at this apparently all come to that conclusion, that if there's an all-out war or a naval war between China and the United States over Taiwan, it's the Chinese at the moment who have the advantage. So I think that this is a reckless move. I think sending Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan is also a reckless move. Maybe the United States would suffer some kind of embarrassment if Nancy Pelosi didn't go to Taiwan, but it would only be a temporary embarrassment. It would not change anything in geopolitical terms. By contrast, if there's an armed conflict in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits, well, the consequences of that are incalculable. So all I would say is people in the West, in the United States, should for once stomach the embarrassment and pull back from the threat of the war. No one really is going to think less of them for doing that. Many people, on the contrary, would think that they've acted sensibly and rationally. Otherwise, pressing on with all of this, even if the Chinese don't react this time, it will simply convince the Chinese that the United States is indeed heading towards the recognition of Taiwan, which, as far as the Chinese are concerned, is an absolute red line. And that will take us closer to a war between the United States and Taiwan, between United States and China, potentially, between China and Taiwan, definitely, which, to be straightforward about it, I cannot see that the United States needs. So that's all I get to say about that at the moment. But I would say that it's probably the most worrying and important news item at the moment. The Russian offensive in Donbass is also a big news item. The Kherson offensive, which hasn't even got underway at the moment, as far as I can see, is, well, perhaps it's a news item of a sort, but it's one about a potential event in the future, not about something which is happening now. Well, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, locals first and foremost, but also Rumble and Telegram and ODYSEE. Also, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also come to our shop and buy the amazing things there, the magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the sweatshirts, the t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.